Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 14th episode of 2026, and the gold sponsor for Fiber for Breakfast is Condux. In Washington, Congress is currently in its second week of its spring break recess and is scheduled to return next week. At the FCC, the Commission is seeking public input on its upcoming 2026 Communications Marketplace Report to Congress, which evaluates the state of competition across the U.S. communications sector. At NTIA, all 56 states and territories have now submitted their final proposals for review. 53 states and territories have received NTIA approval for their final proposals, and NIST has approved 50 of those, making funds, the grant funds available. 38 states and territories now have signed and returned their award agreements, finalizing the process. So things are well underway for the BEAD program at NTIA. And we're now less than 6 weeks away. It's kind of scary. We're getting so close from the Fiber Broadband Association's annual Fiber Connect 2026 conference at the Gaylord Palms in Orlando, May 17th through 20th. We continue to be well ahead of last year's record registration, with a record number of network operators registering this year. And Fiber Connect 2026 will be the largest fiber broadband event in the world. So please ensure that you get your registration complete ASAP and secure your hotel room down at the Gaylord Palms or one of our overflow hotels. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guests were Jeff Hainan from Deloro and Mark Trudeau, the founder and CEO of OpenVault, discussed capacity, competition, and cash flow, the upstream equation. So the real big takeaways from OpenVault's fourth quarter report is the significant growth in demand for upstream broadband capacity. So OpenVault reported that when fiber and DOCSIS cable are provided from this to the same customer base from the same provider, subscribers consume 66% more upstream capacity. And further, they reported that cable subscribers have to purchase a higher price multi-gigabit service just to get enough upstream capacity for work from home, telehealth, online education, and all the things that we need to be able to have, versus being able to have a symmetric service from fiber. So it's a great report. And if you missed last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today at Fiber for Breakfast, our guest is Jim Stegman, the president and CEO of CostQuest, discuss the state of broadband, what the data really reveals. And I was telling Jim, this is one of my favorite sessions of the year because Jim always has such really interesting data. And Jim leads a firm of geospatial data scientists, IT costing, and valuation experts. He has testified before Congress multiple times. He's a recognized authority on the economic cost models and data sets used by telecommunications companies and governments for broadband deployment analysis and valuation. Jim led the design and implementation of the FCC's fabric location data for the national broadband maps and the foundation for NTI's BEAD funding allocations, and provides his expertise to NTI in utilization of the fabric to develop the national fiber to the premise cost estimates. He's also led the design and implementation of the Connect America cost model used by the FCC's CAF program, distribute $1.5 billion annually for broadband deployment. Welcome, Jim. And for our audience, please type in your questions as you go and work those into discussions. So with that, I will hand it over to Jim to tell us a little bit about what happened in version 7 of the broadband data collection.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me back. We're really excited to be back to walk through the latest data that we have from the broadband data collection. And with that, let me just jump right into it. So just for background for people on the call who aren't familiar, the FCC collects broadband availability data every 6 months using the Fabric. The Fabric is a data set that we provide to the FCC and to ISPs so that they can report back. We are in actually year 5 of the effort. The version 9 of the Fabric will be shipped out in July to ISPs for their use to report back. Version 8 was at the providers. They reported back to the FCC, so we should have an updated version 8 map from the FCC probably in about a month and a half. So with that, we'll be able again to dig back into the data, see how things have changed. Today, I'm going to dive into version 7, which was released in end of 2025. But it's the latest data we have on coverage, and it just allows us to understand some additional insights into that. Part of what I'll do is I'll walk through what we call our Broadband America report. We release these about monthly. Each release, we dive into a technology reported in that FCC report. What I'll report on and kind of go through today is the fiber focus that we do, along with the competition focus that we did a couple months ago. So it's some interesting facets that we've uncovered in this, and I think it really shows the importance of fiber as a technology moving forward. So as we look at this last release, the version 7 release versus version 6, there's about 5.2 million additional BSLs. BSLs are broadband serviceable locations. They're the buildings in which we work, live, or play. That is what we've seen actually in the last number of releases, is a significant deployment of new fiber out to locations. We actually, in this last release, we have 182 counties that are now at 99% fiber deployment to the buildings in their county, which is significant. When I look at these maps, it's always interesting to see where the biggest portion of that is, which is in North Dakota. North Dakota has used, the providers in North Dakota used their universal service funds from years ago to build out that fiber network that we see there today. So it's really a testament of the ability of those providers to leverage federal funds to really deploy fiber in areas that typically may not be economic to deploy in. As we look at this, when we go back in time, version 1 data is about June of 2022. So we're 3 years of information available, 3.5 years of information available of that fiber deployment. When we started this exercise back in 2022, there's about 45 million BSLs, or buildings served with fiber. We are now approaching 70 million buildings served with fiber, a testament to the providers out there really building that fiber forward. This is not necessarily just from federal funded locations. A good proportion of this is actually commercially deployed, and we'll walk through that. In the latest data, there are about 1,561 fiber providers in the country. Just if you think about, I never thought there were that many fiber providers, and Gary, we can talk about that kind of after I get through some of these slides. There are 42 new fiber providers in the latest map. 71 providers doubled their footprint. So it's significant, the change every 6 months that we're seeing. If you look at this table, that's just a sample of the providers who really grew their footprint. Clearwave, that's the one that just had the greatest increase in count. They went from 305,000 fiber locations in version 6 to over 1.2 million in version 7, a 300% increase in 6 months. So we're seeing significant growth by all the providers, and there are some providers who are really investing in their network. As we think about that fiber coverage, we saw in this last release, 80% of the counties in the country expanded their coverage in the last 6 months. 4.5% of the counties doubled the number of BSLs served by fiber. So again, just showing the dramatic change, version over version, that we're seeing in this fabric data. As we look at it, one thing that popped out to us, and this is kind of what Gary mentioned, is the competition. We weren't expecting this. Well, we were kind of, because we've been looking at the data, but just the growth in that competition. And basically what we're seeing in this map, and let me explain the map and then talk about the attribute I want to talk about. But in the map, the teal that you see on here is where fiber is served in version 8 that was existing back in version 7. Version 7 additions are what you see in the salmon color. So East Coast or Chicago area, the Atlanta area, you see a significant deployment of new fiber in this last release. And then the blue are those areas that were added in this last release based upon federal funding. There are pockets of it across the country that we're seeing based upon the deployment of RDOF, Community Connect money. BEAD is starting to roll out. Louisiana is actually funding. Providers are actually starting to build out. So we're starting to see that. The interesting thing is approximately about 28% of new fiber is now being built to locations that already have both fiber and cable at them. So what these providers are seeing is that there is good economic deployment potential in certain areas where there are other carriers, and that's what we're seeing in the data. If we walk back to kind of the impact of federal funding, so 5 million locations that we talked about earlier on were added in this last release. That 5 million is well in excess of what will come with BEAD. But BEAD and other federal programs play an important part of this fiber deployment pattern that we're seeing. Overall, for the full country, 8.7% of all locations that we see in version 7 are the result of federal funding. They are actual points or locations that receive money to build out. However, when we go to the rural side, and this is rural areas as defined by the Census Bureau, almost 30% of rural fiber locations in version 7 are the result of federal funding. And these are federal funding programs that are more current. This may not reflect the impact of old universal service programs and other programs that that have evolved over time. But as you look at this map again, the last map was a little deceiving in the western portion of the country, because the western portion of the country, there are vast areas that are unpopulated. What we try to do in this map is just kind of change the coloring scheme. That white that you see on here are those areas of the country that have population or BSLs in them, but that are currently unserved by fiber. So there's still a big footprint upon which we need to expand. But with that over 60% of locations served, we can see how they were built out. The blue are those that will be added with BEAD. The orange are those that are federally funded locations across the country. And you can see it's typically, it is bigger than the actual kind of count of BSLs. And that's typically because federal funding is usually in less dense areas, because that's the areas that really require additional money to make them economically viable.
Milo?
As we look at the next portion, what I wanted to look, I want to kind of dig into that federal funding impact. And what many states are seeing, and we're seeing this in the states that we're supporting as they're rolling out their BEAD implementation. So in Ohio is building out about 37,000 BSLs with the BEAD funding with fiber. However, when we look around those BEAD BSLs, we expect that BEAD deployment will allow those providers to actually deploy fiber to additional locations that may be considered served on cable systems or in fixed wireless, but that aren't currently served with fiber. So this BEAD program will extend that fiber footprint well beyond what we're seeing in Ohio, 37,000. It may get out to potentially 70,000 locations that get impacted by the BEAD program with additional fiber build. So that federal funding has that ancillary benefit of actually impacting my neighbors, the people down the street, because that network, as it's deployed, the viability of customers that are close. And what you're seeing in the table here is, if you're 100 feet away, it's the neighbor that I'm now able to deploy a drop over to that neighbor to serve them with fiber. If we're looking at about 500 feet away, it's a short extension of a fiber path. If we're looking at 1,000, it's a little bit longer extension, but it's still economically viable because I have that baseline network. So that's kind of what we're seeing. So it's an interesting fact. If we come back to competition, This is one thing that we put in our competition report. Just kind of, it lets us dive deep into what's happening as that fiber is built out. So if we go back to that initial release, it was about 13% of the fiber being built out at that point in time was at locations that neither had cable or fiber service. We're at about 15.3% today. When we go back in time, about 60% of that build out were to locations that had cable service but no fiber. We're at about 50% today, or in version 7. I talked about the 28% earlier. You can actually see that about 7% of the fiber build out is actually to locations that already have fiber but not cable. And then 28% is to locations that have fiber and cable. And this is where we're seeing that overbuild concept that we didn't expect as much as we're seeing now. What we thought to do is potentially just look at the nature of that overbuild. So as we thought about it, we looked at, is this constant across all providers, or is there a different pattern? So let me walk you through these charts here. So on the right-hand side, what we're seeing is we looked at those large providers, the AT&Ts, the Comcast, the Charters, the big ones out there, and how they're deploying their fiber network. And as we look out over time, it's not changed significantly, but the teal line on top is where that fiber provider was building out and there were no fiber competitors. So it's around, it was at 80% to start with, it's around 75% today. So it stayed pretty constant, but that means about 25% of their build is actually occurring where there's actually an existing fiber provider. This typically occurs in urban and suburban areas where the economics allow that second provider to come in, gain enough take rate to make the economics of that fiber deployment play out. The odd thing that we saw in this latest round of data is on the left-hand side, when we looked at smaller providers and what they were doing. So back in the first release of the fabric, it was that 80-20 split that we saw on the big providers. But as we move through time, what we're seeing is that pattern, there's a dichotomy in that deployment pattern between large providers and smaller providers. What we saw in the last release, so in that version, this might actually be version 6 release, about 45% of the build on these smaller providers was actually overbuild. So it's much different than the larger providers. Again, we're trying to figure out what this means, what's going on. We have some thoughts on it, but we're still trying to track that down. It'll be interesting to see how this evolves in version 8 release that we'll get, as I said, in about a month and a half. So with that, Gary, I'll hand it back to you to let's walk through some questions and talk through the information I presented.
And this is always super interesting. Thank you so much. So maybe to start with just helping the audience understand, the data as far as you have 116 million broadband services locations. When we report, we say there's about 130 million primary residents and 10 million secondary homes, 140 million. So the difference between 116 million BSLs and 140 million is largely because the FCC defines a BSL as one location. So if you have an apartment building, for example, we would count that with all the different residents in the apartment. Each resident would be a location versus just the building. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the FCC approaches it, as you said, Gary, is that they're looking at building deployment. So the home, the apartment building counts as one. Potentially a condo unit that looks like an apartment complex counts as one. It was a decision made at the point in time that the fabric was created that that's how we are going to track things. However, in the fabric itself, we also count the number of units at that BSL, and our unit count is consistent with what you talked about. We have about 135 million homes in the data. We don't necessarily capture all the secondary all the time. Let me say it. We don't necessarily capture the secondary directly. They still are in the fabric as a BSL, but we may not call them residential. They may be called a different attribute. Overall, I think we have about 165 million units in the data, if I remember correctly, from our last release. So we do have that information in there. It's just the translation between what you think about as customers passed versus buildings passed.
So thanks, Jim, and that's always really useful. So one thing I'm always surprised is the number of active fiber providers. So you had 1,561 fiber providers in the U.S. That's up, I guess, 42 new entrants since 6 months, right? Since the previous version 6. That seems like a whole lot of fiber providers. Can you provide some thought on that?
Yeah, I'm always shocked just by the count. You never think of the count being that big. I think as far as licensees of the data that we provide out for reporting, I think there's, I want to say 2,500 to 3,000 broadband providers in the country. Never thought there was that many when we first started this exercise almost 5 years ago. But what you're saying is there's just a lot of small fiber providers in rural parts of the country that as you count them, they start to add up significantly across. If you look at BEAD and what happened in BEAD, you know, there are certain states where there were 30, 40 different winners in those states of funding. Many of them are companies you never heard of. They're new entrants coming in or smaller entrants that looked at deploying or expanding their footprint in the parts of the country that they serve.
So, you know, last week we had Open Vault on, and they talked about their latest data really shows that there's a convergence on 2 tiers of service. So the first tier would be kind of lowest. If you're price sensitive, it'd be 200 to 400 meg. And then, or you would just buy as much bandwidth as you can, you'd be in the gigabit plus tier. And so really they saw no interest in anything under 200 meg and little interest in kind of that between 400 to gigabit. So it's either 200 to 400 or gigabit. So why does the FCC, why don't they increase their definition of broadband from the 100 by 20?
It's a good question. I think in part it's a decision made at the FCC. I really don't have insights as to how they set those speed attributes, but I know they have looked at other speeds, and we may see a change in the future. But as of today, it's at 100 megabits down, 20 megabits up, and that's really the basis of the BEAD program as well as to how that funding was dispersed.
Well, what about as far as if they were to increase it, say a minimum of gigabit or even 200 to 400 meg, how would that impact the number of unserved BSLs?
I don't have a good answer for that. We can look at that. I mean, the beauty of the fabric data and the broadband data collection is in that data, they carriers report the speeds available at each location. So we can quickly summarize that information to understand what's going on. Most likely, you would expect that number to increase over where we're at with 120, simply for the fact that there are some technologies out there that may be stretching their capabilities to get to that. There are other technologies that can far exceed the 120 that are being captured in that as well.
All right, what about, so what explains the large number of new BSLs that came out in version 7?
Yeah, new BSLs are as we go through each creation of the data, we get parcel information, we get new building footprints, we get new tax assessor information, and we get challenge data from the FCC through consumer challenges or bulk challenges from providers, from counties, from states, whatever it may be. Those all get factored into our build of the fabric. So as we look at that, we always expect that there will be an increase in the number of BSLs, one, because of new construction. So a good proportion of those are new construction that we've identified in the last release. new construction comes in time. It may not be recognized immediately as the building goes live because we're waiting for our underlying data sets to capture that information, but we do get them in. But a good proportion are new buildings that have been identified. The other thing is, we continuously make improvements in our processing, our machine learning, our AI to make sure that we're capturing the latest and greatest information. So we may uncover new locations in the data set that weren't previously identified. So that's but again, the biggest portion is those new homes that have been built.
All right, and so also the audience had asked in the last slide, the dichotomy, what was the competition overbuild include? Does it include all types of technologies or just overbuild existing fiber?
That last chart was just overbuilding on fiber. We were looking to really see that fiber versus fiber concept in that last chart. We could look at it as well as looking at fiber and cable. But we thought the more interesting thing was just that pure competition against another fiber provider.
Okay, one of the other things I think you mentioned is, so once the smoke clears, we have now the BEAD money going out the door. So everything that's earmarked for BEAD, everything that's been in all these other programs, we still have, I guess your data shows about 2.1 million BSLs that are going to be unserved or underserved by any of these programs?
There will be unserved locations that we still see coming out. Part of that is some of the federal programs haven't been reported as served yet, so RDOF is still in play. The Community Connect is still in place, so some of those will become connected. But as we just talked about, there are new locations coming online, new construction that continuously add to that.
And so, I mean, I think what NTI is looking for non-deployment is do a couple cleanup rounds. So certainly there should be a few million unserved locations that these states could target that had fallen between the cracks, I'm assuming.
I've heard similar thoughts coming out, or rumors that one of the efforts in the non-deployment round is kind of a cleanup, because we know there have been RDOF defaults, we know there have been new locations added, and we know there potentially may be some BEAD defaults as carriers start to look at the agreements in place of whether they can adhere to it, and with potential cost increases or other issues, they may actually default. So we're likely to see all that as part of that cleanup round should it happen.
And another audience question is, they might have missed a comment, but is there a breakdown or separation of consumer versus business locations?
There is not in the fabric itself. There is a, let me walk back. There is in the fabric, there is a building location type that is in the data set that identifies residential locations, business locations, but there's also a mixed category where we see both business and residential in the same building. So you can get all the residential counts out of that unit data. It's where people run into issues using just the baseline data is that unit count for mixed use could either be a portion res, portion biz, and you have to split that out. In the background, we do have the residential counts and we do have the business counts available should they be needed.
So one of the things our data showed for last year is, we did record deployment, over 10 million homes served, which kind of aligns with your data showing over 5 million in 6 months. But 40%, so 60% has been from, the last year was from the tier ones like AT&T and Verizon, but 40% of deployment last year was from, non-tier ones. And you're showing 1,561 providers. So there's certainly a lot of, companies out there. And you're also, I guess the other part is you're showing that these small providers are 45% of their deployment is actually where there might be competition. So what is your thought? Are these smaller providers, are they typically rural providers that have been outside of little cities, little towns, and now they're, have the opportunity to go in and try to compete for kind of more prime subscribers, or what is your thought there?
Yeah, in part, I think you had a good insight there. We think it's an expansion of their footprints into adjacent areas that may be served by another provider. It may be a fixed wireless provider that is providing service in the adjacent area to maintain the customer. As they expand their footprint, they then go into those areas where they have fixed wireless, convert those customers over so that they enter the market with a fairly high initial take rate as to compared to trying to grow it from a ground zero impact.
So what's interesting is, our data shows there's about 60 million homes left to serve as we build out, fiber to everybody across the country. But when we look at the total addressable market, it's more like 130 million, because what we're seeing is second and third and fourth passings of the same homes by other providers. And that seems to align with some of the data you guys are seeing.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, if you think of the cable companies who are in parts of their footprint now converting over to fiber, in those areas, they may have had one of the other carriers come in and overbuild their coax system or their hybrid fiber coax. They're now coming back in to actually compete against that fiber provider by deploying their own fiber. So we're going to see continued, I think, growth in the fiber deployment amongst the cable companies. Along with just the continued expansion from the current fiber providers that we have.
Well, Jim, I could talk to you about this all day. I always love your data. So thank you so much for all the research and your broadband data collection that you guys do every 6 months. So thanks for sharing that with our audience.
And thanks for having me.
I want to thank everybody for joining us and look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. Our guest is Jeff Lopez, the director of New Mexico's Office of Broadband Access and Expansion, discuss smart funding, smart deployment, the strategy of driving 100% coverage. So thanks for joining us again. Thanks, Jim. And we'll see you guys next Wednesday.